But yes, this is a long way of saying that I'm very honored to be introducing Luis Camnitzer, who is a foremost...
Careful.
Well, thinker, but also playfully so, provocateur, educator, among many other things. He also has many art historical contributions that I will also not list as an artist also, and so on and so forth. We said we are not doing the bio list. Yes, so Luis is here for many reasons also, because it helps me think about and reminds me a lot of why impossible things are important, and also how not to think about what art is in a way. I will leave it at that, and I'll let you take over. He is going to talk about unpredictability and the cat, and I'm very happy that you are all here tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So, I entered art school when I was 16, without a clue about what art might be. It was decided that I was skillful with my hands and that my skill should be developed further. Once in school, discussions about art referred to form and content, with the belief that one needed to be a good realist before entering any avant-garde aesthetic. The most frequently used argument was that Picasso had started as a rigorous figurative painter before he was able to develop his personal experimental art. Nobody considered that, given when he was born, he had no other choice. That art was a nonverbal tool of communication was a given, and that it was a set of skills to make objects was another undiscussed characteristic. The focus was on the looks of what one made and about what it communicated. And those favoring form eventually tended to abstraction. Those leaning toward content became figurative and often political. In Latin America of the mid-50s, this ended dividing artists. Abstractionists were classified as bourgeois elitists who served capitalism, and those using figuration were seen as leftist, friendly to communism and social realism, or conservative fascists. In this context, works of art were to be definitive statements that represented the artist's beliefs and a sense of certainty. Meanwhile, I fell into expressionism and ethical anarchism, which muddied all the boundaries, but didn't help much to bridge the divide. On one hand, my expressionist work was an act of romantic self-centeredness, while my beliefs about the need to share power equitably were the exact opposite. After a decade with my anarchism unchanged, I moved away from expressionism into conceptualism and somewhat resolved the contradiction. However, 7 decades later, and fairly clear about issues of power, I'm still struggling with the question of what art might really be. This lack of definition is probably not a bad thing, since although I didn't know it at the time, indeterminacy is the fertile ground in which art navigates best. There are many possible functions and meanings of art, something that isn't helped by the diversity of meanings of the word. They are usually mixed in different degrees, and all are somewhat true. I will underline one of them in terms of purpose, because I feel it's the most important. My pick, art as a tool for cognition, puts it the closest to education, and therefore also to being a true cultural agent. The same is for education. One of the big questions raised, therefore, is, where is power located? Is it in the presentation or in and the recipient. The answer determines the relation between art and the viewer. It is one determined by the transfer of information, or is it acting as a trigger to start new processes? And if so, what kind? Or is it to foster consumption and property? These are basically questions that also fit education and determine if the educational process should lead to submission or to liberation. However, no matter what aspect one would pick to define art in a narrower spectrum, being aesthetic pleasure, nonverbal storytelling, ability to render, and so on, the question of what makes a product qualify as art remains unanswered. We only know that reasons are there, and sometimes, from case to case, we aren't even sure if that is really true. Some decades ago, I proposed a fictional history about the origin of the word art and its lack of definition. During the Stone Age, somebody produced something unexplainable and yet unnamed. It was notable because it elicited awe among the onlookers. Somebody among the disconcerted admirers broke the silence and exclaimed, "Let's call it art." The word arbitrary, like all words, stuck. It stuck so well that people, from then on, tried to fit objects they made into this word. The hope was for the objects to be accepted. However, in doing so, they believed that whatever power there was, it was trapped in the object. This belief prevented people from recognizing that the sought-after initial awe was not included in the name, but in their inability to name it. This in turn led the artist to first adapt closely to their understanding of the word, and second, to focus on the technique used to produce preceding pieces. The awe part was neglected, allowing virtuous skills to take over. As it was predictable, this produced experimentation with a variety of other techniques, generating a long tradition of craftspeople. The concept still prevails today, both in conventional thinking and in how art is taught in most traditional schools. While I was starting to write this, I had a plumber come to fix a leak in my studio. He saw my old etching press, some work by friends on the walls, and mostly a disarray of papers and books all over the place. There were no easels, paints, or brushes around. Nevertheless, he commented, "You're a painter?" echoing the commonplace trope. Meanwhile, traditional schools keep teaching painting 1, painting 2, etc., with equivalent sequences in other media. Even when dematerialized or a medium is called practice, these still tend to be treated as crafts and use appropriate protocols. When and if students emerge as artists, it is in the form of craft plus people. They are artisans able to communicate a little more than just technical expertise. There are many masterful craftspeople that are lousy artists. This is because the plus part remains ignored or elusive. It is only this plus part that is indeterminate and gives us trouble to grasp. For schools, it is the skills that are the easy component to teach and become the main focus. They can be translated into 12-step programs that lead to some form of applicability. It makes it a training methodology rather than true education, more or less the same as in schooling in general. Art school washes its hands from the plus part, which still imponderable and non-quantifiable is left to the student's luck to find it. Most schools will argue that the plus part cannot be taught. The talent is needed to do it, and that it is something very special that works best in socially and academically protected areas. The 19th century term art for art's sake was created as one way to protect art by cordoning it off from the demands of quotidian interest. Defining art as the production of useless things was another one. When in the late 18th century Kant termed art purposeless or useless, he intended this in a descriptive way. He may even have had the intention of liberating art from any external authority. Today, however, the word useless is derogatory because we accept practical applicability as a positive and absolute value. However, the financial world has revised and updated the role of art by giving it a new purpose. Although one can't do anything practical with it, art can generate money. So much so that often it's not the actual artwork that is traded, but its certification of ownership. Finance has provided a second-degree level of usefulness. It is something like eating the meat of herbivores and then claim, like I do, to be a vegetarian once removed. For art, this change of levels clarified some issues and messed up others. By placing ownership on a document external to the artwork, one would presume that the artist-product relation lost rigidity and opened more possibilities. But for art schools, it made it more difficult to define their purpose. Is an art school a place to form craftspeople, to teach the plus part, or to help create aesthetic tools of investment with the corresponding ability to administer them? An art school administrator would claim that it is a combination of all three, which sounds reasonable and useful for our times. Artists have to survive and feed their families, and that's a good reason to equip them to handle economic reality, both by training into marketable skills and by understanding financial issues. However, while left unstated, it still is the vague plus part that justifies the existence of art institutions and all these speculations. A century ago, the still influential Bauhaus school tried to bypass all these questions by declaring that there is no difference between fine art and applied arts, and by seeking to work with industry. Fine and applied were supposed to be one and the same, and Walter Gropius, the founder and director, firmly believed art couldn't be taught. That lifted the status of the applied arts, but didn't do much for the fine ones. Traditional artists producing useless objects were slowly excluded from the school. In terms of curricula, it was the Bauhaus 4 course that became most influential for schools today. The introductory course was used as preparation, but also as a stringent talent filtering device. Today, it's still the standard for art teaching and probably will continue for a while. However, then and today, assignments and explorations relied heavily on propositions that were closer to the thinking used in design than to art explorations. Roy Ascott's ground course for art was a remarkable exception to this. He introduced the possibility of indeterminate solutions. Offered in England between 1961 and 1963 in the now defunct Ealing School of Art, Ascott's assignment asked, imagine waking up some morning, being a sponge, and describe the day. And if 15 ragged crisscross lines stand for a cough, how would you draw the BBC time signal? The variation in pedagogical approaches trying to reach the plus zone brings us back to the awe point I raised earlier. Awe here does not imply admiration and submissive reception of previously unknown information. It is only a checking instrument that refers to recognition that we are taking stock of this information. Awe confronts us with the plus part and tells us that art is working as it should. It reveals something previously hidden, that it managed to make new meanings, or led us to make new meanings. The awe that once may have elicited the word art surely wasn't based on excelling skills or possible hedonistic pleasure. It was and is related to the impact it has on our knowledge. In that sense, awe is not a property of the object, but of the relationship we have with the object. Contrasting with this, however, we are educated to iconize works of art, the same way religious objects are iconized. We are supposed to perceive them as filled with sacred power and emitting awe, forgetting that we are the ones that fill them with it. Art schools that follow accept the power of the object are really icon schools, with icons destined to be places of authority, like galleries and museums. Yet, from the point of view of cognition, art is a tool to learn from, and not just, if at all, to enjoy. Art appreciation, a course offering that serves to broaden the consumer base, is a secondary byproduct. Today, seeing art as knowledge and not making makes me feel that I'm getting closer to an understanding of the plus part. The processes of dematerialization that have transformed the art field during the last century have helped the shift very much. It's not that appreciation has been dismissed or diminished. There is as much kitsch and pomposity in conceptualism as one finds in traditional art presentations. However, access has dramatically opened. Quote, "My 5-year-old child can do that," is not a threat anymore, and we now have the freedom to imagine unhampered by any constraints, both as consumers and as producers. Duchamp's ready-mades, a form of art by designation, liberated us from the short list of media permitted by the art by production view. Art became, at least potentially, a collectively owned process for inquiry and processing information that enlarges and enriches the acquisition and processing of knowledge. As with literacy and numeracy, art is a basic organizational tool, and it should be part of all of education and not be considered an activity reserved for a few professionals competing among themselves. Once we take art out of the craft world and put it in the realm of cognition, we have to ask, what is the difference with other forms of instruments of knowledge? Both science and religion claim they reveal unknown things and make meanings. It is true that scientific contributions may produce awe. And it's true that religion both wants to generate awe and make us believe it does. Yet, it's no coincidence that my original work that generated the word art was distinguishable from both science and religion. Since its author is fictional, we don't have any way of knowing if this distinction was intentional. Or rather, you have to take my word for it. But even as the author might have been respected for practical discoveries or mystical insights, the new work had more in common with open-ended wishful thinking. It probably responded to the question, what if? The question of what if is a standard form of inquiry, but in art it is based more on uncertainty than on any certainty associated with experienced reality. And maybe it is there, on the scale of possibilities of cognition, where the difference between scientific and artistic thinking and imagination takes place. It is not that science lacks wishful thinking or imagination. It is that what the scientist ultimately seeks is certainty. And that kind of search, the thinking is much reduced, and when certainty is not reached or is not available, the situation becomes very uncomfortable. In 1935, theoretical physicists Ernst Schrödinger and Albert Einstein were faced with this kind of discomfort. Advances in explanation of the universe had shown certainty to be, if not questionable, at least more elusive than it was known before the explanations. In 1927, Werner von Heisenberg presented his uncertainty principle that stated that both the position and momentum of particles could not be determined with precision at the same time. Any increase in precision about the position will increase the uncertainty of its velocity. Meanwhile, colleagues were in process of developing quantum theory and proposing the state of superposition, the state where either or coexist instead of excluding each other. Schrödinger, though involved in this line of work, including the question of how measurement may influence what's being measured, felt his friends were going too far. With Einstein's support, he poked fun at superposition by developing the thought experiment known as Schrödinger's cat. His cat was locked in a box together with radioactive photons that had a 50% chance of decay. During that ambiguous stage, both possibilities coexisted in the state known as superposition. Together with the cat and photons, there also were a bottle with hydrocyanic acid, a hammer, and a Geiger counter. The counter would detect the decay if it ever happened, then activate the hammer to break the bottle, release the acid, and kill the cat. Until then, the superposition of the photon extended to the cat, which is to be considered simultaneously alive and dead. Quantum theory went further. It assumes that if someone opens a box during the state of superposition, an equivalent to crude measuring, the coexistence of both realities would be broken and forced to settle into the observer's single reality. The cat then would turn out to be either alive or dead. As an artist and outsider in these matters, I'm not concerned that much with the accuracy of the experiment or the story. Instead, I always wondered, why in all of this nobody took the cat's perspective into account? How does it feel to live in a double reality contingent on one unpredictable and randomly decaying photon? While the lack of transparency goes against our rational thinking and our wish for certainty, presumably it's to the cat's advantage to have faith in superposition and hope it goes on forever. This uncertainty is what keeps the cat partially and potentially alive for as long superposition is not broken. It's also consistent with the acceptance of randomness as a fact of life. The point is that the face of Schrödinger's cat, or maybe henceforth Schrödinger-Camnitzer's cat face, is similar to the face we have as artists in our research. When a scientist explores uncertainty, it is to erase it and bring closure to the question. Scientific results must be predictable, either when ideas are developed forward or when, like in retroengineering, steps are traced back from the conclusion towards the beginning. For the cat, as much as for the artist, the point is different. It is to unravel what is unknown and unpredictable without reaching closure. It is to reveal something we don't know, to elaborate on it, but without condemning it to a definitive life or death. Interesting questions in art, and I'm here referring to the Western contemporary version of it, should generate more interesting questions. For us, they should not eliminate uncertainty, but capture it and help us respect it, not as a transitory state, but as a source of nourishment. In art, ending uncertainty means to bury our research in anachronism and have the result sold as a dead icon for cultural necrophiliacs. One could say that the elimination of uncertainty alienates the art experience from our living experience. It gives art a fake autonomy that impoverishes our life by promising harmony, but in fact, putting obstacles in the way of reaching it. Maybe art is a proper tool to restore superposition from where it's gone, and thus preserve our ability to become part of a general harmony. It reminds me of Erich Fromm's ethical and non-religious reinterpretation of an action in the Jewish celebration of Shabbat. Fromm used inaction as a way to connect with harmony. I'm going to quote, "It's not rest per se in the sense of not making an effort, physically or mentally. It is rest in the sense of the re-establishment of complete harmony between human beings and between them and nature. Nothing must be destroyed and nothing be built. The Shabbat is a day of truth in the human battle with the world. On the Shabbat, one lives as if one has nothing, pursuing no aim except being, that is, expressing one's essential powers, praying, studying, eating, drinking, singing, making love." Notably, in his list, Fromm did not include art as a possible active alternative. Perhaps this was because a conventional view of art as production, where objects would add to the existing world and disturb ecological balance. I would think that if Schrödinger had claimed his box as a work of art, today it would be traded at high prices and become a proud display in a museum. Before thinking of opening the box, people would look to see if it was made with wood or metal and if it was properly finished. The box would be admired and maybe even venerated with a velvet robe for protection, aided by a "don't touch" sign. But the idea to investigate the thoughts of the cat in regards to certainty, those that might evoke Fromm's statement, would remain absent. Uncertainty goes against prevailing scientific and religious thinking. Science uses logic to deny mystery, while the religion delegates justifications to higher powers. This, of course, assuming both justifications and higher powers actually exist. So far, only art has the potential to embrace mystery as a form of unbiased certainty. Without appealing to dogmas and without causing any anxiety, it addresses facets of the unknown that hide other unknowns. Therefore, contrary to what science may assume, mystery in art does not cater to obscurantism, but opens minds. Humbly, mystery is one state of knowledge that may be actively faced by the artist to contextualize and enrich rationality. Unlike other forms of knowledge, it has the ability to maintain and share endless flexibility in imagination by disorienting and reorienting. Maybe this comes closer to defining the plus part. Conflicts and negotiations of cognition take place both within and between secular and religious systems of belief. Both are areas of institutionalized cultural power that makes us believe they are all-encompassing. However, using true uselessness as a protective cover, imagination and its creations are able to escape this polarity and maintain a critical distance from everything else. It is this distance that gives the artist power to override the system, first privately and then publicly. More than any particular content, it is this what makes art a profoundly subversive and political activity. Useless, unquantifiable, and posing potential threats to conventional thinking, art is unsurprisingly degraded to serve embellishment and to be a manifestation of leisure and luxury. This makes art a classist instrument and places the emphasis on the objects and situations that remain after the process of creation has been finished, rather than on the process itself. It is not surprising that making art and its products are viewed as an enhanced form of disciplinary artisanship. Meanwhile, science is identified with general knowledge, and religion is considered a tool that promises a shot at sainthood. Nobody would think of scientists as mere microscopists, hadron collidoris, that happens when you write and don't speak it out, or any other tool-defined profession. Nobody would call a priest or a shaman a speaker. Even in the non-art humanities, to have philosophers or historians mentioned as typists or enhanced typists would raise eyebrows. But if I answer of what do you do question with I am an artist, nobody asks me about what problem I might be researching. As happened with my plumber, the answer is almost inevitably followed by, are you a painter? Notably, in the same decade that Kant talked about uselessness in art, the Constitution of the United States was underlining the protection of useful arts. Ratified in 1788, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8, the Constitution grants Congress the power, and I quote, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. Kant's ideas about aesthetics were published in 1790. I can't imagine that he was responding to the writers of the US Constitution, or that they even were mutually cognizant. Kant had the luxury of being able to exercise thinking without the burden of trying to stitch together a country. Also at the time, the meaning of the word art didn't exactly coincide with today's Art Basel's version. Nevertheless, it's interesting that the concern of the writers of the Constitution were both applicability and compensation of authors' rights. It was to some degree the recognition that intellectual work is a form of actual labor. However, in that process, the Constitution also set down guidelines that by promoting applicability in a world defined by certainty, today culminate with a push for STEM curricula based on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And they all lead to the cutting of art programs. In practical terms, the ideological split between Kant and the US Constitution ended with Kant's defeat. But the split preceded both contenders, and symptoms started as early as monetization became the main purpose of life. Even before Benjamin Franklin coined his "time is money" in in 1748, monetization had slowly and insidiously started to affect our perception and edit our reality, our aesthetic sense. An analysis of how we thoughtlessly use rectangles in daily life shows how economic criteria have bypassed our consciousness to shape the way we see. The use of rectangles to construct sinks presumably came about with the realization that columns work best when they stand up vertically. Beams, therefore, work better when horizontal, and perpendicularity became something very useful. Applied to fabrication, it also turned out that there is less waste of material when cutting adjoining rectangles than adjoining circles. Hence, doors, windows, tables, as well as paintings, books, and photographs all adopted that shape. We don't see rectangles anymore. They have become an invisible norm, which is fine, because they don't interfere with whatever information they present. What is interesting, however, is that when we look at something with the idea to reproduce or render it, we instinctively use our hands doing rectangularity. We frame them all. Even cameras are designed to carefully crop images into rectangles, although lenses, as well as our eyes, register the information in circular fields. The invisibility of rectangles in formal packaging signals that there are two parts in form giving. One serves as meaningless support for communication, and the other is related to the meanings, with objects being their formalization. We learn mostly from the part related to meanings, and it is the area where we place true originality, that it is there where new meanings are originated. This tells us very clearly that we should change our focus from making to cognition. With that switch, art is something different to making paintings or videos, and design is not just dealing with the making of lamps or cars. It is about knowing both what we want to know and how we proceed, and then how we formalize the experience. In this context, the useless versus useful distinction goes much deeper than how applicability relates to the creative act. We're facing here a separation between cognitive methods, something that professional schools of art and design tend to ignore. In design, the solution being sought is located within the problem. In art, this is less clear, since the solution may be somewhere outside. In design, the requirement for functionality dominates the process and makes it a deductive tool subservient to usability. One could say that creation here works like nibbling at a pie in search for the best raisin inside. This makes design a centripetal activity. In 1891, Louis Sullivan codified the process when he told the world, form follows function. 40 years later, Adolf Loos took Sullivan one step further, claiming that anybody who wears a tattoo is a criminal or a criminal to be. Today I found out that Richmond is the third tattooed city in the country. So take it from there. Very differently, art is a centrifugal activity. Raisins may be anywhere, and during an often frustrating search, the pie is constantly remade. Laws and whole systems of order are open to rewriting. That makes art, when at its best, a platform for critical perception and subversive activity. So we learn art history as a sequence of styles. These are much less important than we think. They are nothing more than quantitative clusters of artistic and sometimes ideological allegiance. Joining a style may facilitate communication and help recognition, but it's also a way of insertion in the measurement system of curators and historians. For the historian, styles help a linear narrative, one that often implies progress and simplifies storytelling. Yet, in spite of all the importance given to art movements, from the point of view of cognition, it is the functionalism promoted by designers that had a much bigger role in our taste and perception. Being part of an economic ideology, modern design was able to set down the rules of certainty and create its own powerful aesthetic. Redundancy and noise were eliminated, cracks and scratches forbidden, the look of newness was reaffirmed, and elegance was promoted as a good administration of information. Art and design have two different understandings of the term modern. While a majority of the consumer base accepts modern design as something desirable and worth keeping up with, the reaction of that same public confronted with modern art usually is one of incomprehension. But there is another cognitive difference between art and design. Though a schematic division, it can be said that the designer tends to explore ingenuity, while the artist tries to generate something that didn't exist before. There is a difference between the unexpected and the unpredictable, and this is one of the elements that separates ingenuity from creativity. Ingenuity recombines available ingredients to solve a problem in new and better ways. The result is unexpected because otherwise the thing already would be in existence. Ingenuity is mostly applied to usefulness and increases effects within the realm of certainty. Creativity tries to deal with unpredictability and focuses on the unconditional generation of new meanings, including those belonging to uncertainty. While the designer is held back by usability, the artist is controlled by the need of communication. The obvious temptation to fight against homogenization is to do so by praising those aspects that don't fit homogeneity. This praise is socially accepted, at least as long as the disturbance is controllable and doesn't disrupt too much. Terms like authorship, originality, and other ego-competitive terms are used to designate, bridge, and administer any of these interventions in positive ways. When used as praises, they reaffirm a separation of individuals selected from the collective. Language is a tool for control and therefore also contains a range of deriding nomenclature to pick people and keeping them in place so they don't go overboard. People labeled squares and nerds are still acceptable. Eccentrics are fine within certain limits. Dissidents are to be isolated, and lunatics or lunatics frowned upon with a commitment into an institution being at the end of the scale. This brings me to STEM curricula, which have become the big enemy of the humanities and of art in particular. Adding an A for art and making the acronym STEM into STEAM is intended as damage control. However, the addition of art is explicitly made to help STEM employees use ingenuity and solve problems in more innovative ways. The push for competitive way of processing and generating information. It would help for those that choose to professionalize in art, there would be a clear presentation of the ethical responsibilities of making art. It would help if there was a clarification of the difference between art production in the field of commodities and finance and art used as cultural and pedagogical agency. It would help if whatever direction the artist decides to take, decision is made responsibly in the context of good and constructive citizenship. It would help if all this is done without being forced into certainties preordained by narrow interest. It would help if they left us open to effectively administer and live with uncertainty, not as a bearer of negativity, but as a tool for ever generating the potentiality of harmony. Thank you.